Hello everybody, it's the Clown Decade. It's going to get worse before it gets better, etc, etc. Let's get right into this one because I think it's going to be quite funny. So, over the past week, Richard Murphy has put out two videos. 6 days ago, he put out a video saying why we have a national debt, and then 3 days ago he put out a video saying we do not have a national debt, which has to be one of the funniest juxtapositions I think I've ever seen in my life. But I appreciate at this point that most of you might be saying, hang on, who is Richard Murphy? Well, he is a former British chartered accountant, probably because he knows nothing about economics, and also a political economist who campaigns on issues of tax avoidance and tax evasion. He advises the Trades Union Congress, one of the biggest unions in the UK, on economics and taxation, and founded the Tax Justice Network. He is a professor of accounting practice at University of Sheffield Management School, so don't do accounting practice at University of Sheffield Management School. However, he is best known for his involvement in the Corbyn campaign. In 2015, many of Murphy's ideas were taken up as proposed policies by Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party leadership election. Corbyn was elected and became leader of the Labour Party and leader of the opposition. His economics policies were dubbed Corbynomics. This included a policy called People's Quantitative Easing, which we'll go through in a second, a broader development of a policy Murphy launched in 2010 called Green Quantitative Easing. And if this already doesn't signal that the man just puts things that sounds nice together to put forward his brain-dead policies, I don't know what else will. Corbyn also cited Murphy's estimates of there being £120 billion of missing tax revenue as part of the economic plan issued during his election campaign, stating that this was enough to double the NHS budget. And just for reference, this isn't true. The NHS budget in 2015 was about £140 billion, so it's not quite enough to double it, but I suppose it's close enough that we will give him a bit of leeway there. In addition, Corbyn adopted several of the remedies that Murphy had advocated, including country-by-country reporting, to address this revenue gap. Murphy later clarified that, in his view, not all of the missing revenue was recoverable, and at best £20 billion of it could be collected. Not all is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting there. That is, 1/6 of that estimate is recoverable. So what's the point of even saying £120 billion is missing, if clearly it's only £20 billion? Anyway, this is classic Richard Murphy talking point. Big up that inequality is a huge issue at the moment, say the only way to do it is by public spending, and then come up with absolutely crackpot ways to actually get that spending done. And People's Quantitative Easing is the perfect example of this. So Corbyn proposed to have the Bank of England create money to invest in housing and public transport, described by Corbyn as People's Quantitative Easing. Now, the way that this is different to classic quantitative easing, by using the money raised via buying government bonds to invest into banks and investment firms, which obviously stimulates the economy by, well, allowing for more investment money provided by the Bank of England. This is different because it's putting it straight into building public housing and public transport. This would aim to turn the UK into a high-skill, high-tech economy by putting the money not into things that would improve people's skills and improve the technology of the economy, and to build more council houses in order to lower long-term housing benefit costs. So a huge issue we're having at the moment with quantitative easing is that all the money is going into investment firms that are effectively just there to make money for effectively redistribution anyway. Money for benefits, money for pensions, money for HS2, things that aren't particularly helping the economy become high skill or high tech. However, I will say it is actually more useful for stimulating the economy than putting it straight into council housing and public transport. To achieve this, the bank would purchase bonds for a state-owned national investment bank. Again, this would all be better if what you did in the first place was, say, I don't know, frack the UK to get a load of gas in, to sell it off, to then make a national investment fund. Do literally anything that would make money. No, instead they're thinking of making money by building people's council houses and improving bus networks. The policy is based on ideas put forward by Richard Murphy, who again originally called it the Green Quantitative Easing, and is now called People's Quantitative Easing. Basically what it means is we're going to spaff money up the wall. Murphy argues it is a policy designed for use in 2020 in the event the economy remains flat despite traditional quantitative easing, with low inflation, low interest rates, high unemployment and low wages. If the economy is growing strongly, people's quantitative easing would not be needed, as increasing tax revenues would pay for necessary investment. Again, I wanted to read that last part out because we're about to hear basically the exact opposite from Richard Murphy. Because here it implies that Richard Murphy said tax revenue pays for government investment and government spending. He's about to say the opposite. But I would like to say at this point, thank God Corbyn didn't get in, because my God, you think the country's a mess at the moment? Corbyn's government would have literally accelerated the exodus of people moving to Australia. This would have been horrendous. Anyway, I think it's about time we get into Richard Murphy's videos. So, first up, why we have a national debt.
We really need a national debt in the UK.
We've certainly always had a national debt, so whether that means we need one or not, I don't know. I think it's more a case that you will always have some sort of national debt. The issue we're having with national debt at the moment is that it's nearly 100% of GDP. To a lot of laymen's, that seems absolutely crazy. How does a national debt become bigger than GDP? Well, effectively the reasoning behind it is that as GDP grows, obviously your debt to GDP ratio will reduce, and that's effectively how we managed to get out of this big old 260% of GDP spike after the Napoleonic Wars. 1800s was effectively, capitalism gone rife in Britain, and it managed to get us to a national debt of below 40%, simply because we just kept growing the economy and didn't borrow as much. And I would absolutely kill to live in a world like that today, but no, we gotta keep borrowing.
If you listen to our politicians, you wouldn't believe that. They talk about the national debt as if it is some sort of curse that we must get rid of.
Well, having a national debt is obviously going to have problems. If it's bad that people get into debt, why would it be good if the government get into debt? Don't get me wrong, I can understand why you should get into debt sometimes. For example, I've recently bought a house. Having a mortgage put me into debt. But it's a place for me to live, and it's an asset that I can put money into. I understand this theory, but the problem is that when we are in a time of basically zero growth, how can you at all defend the fact that we've managed to get into a situation where we have 100% GDP debt? It's obviously not sustainable, and it's obviously not being used to stimulate growth. This is the problem.
And that is so untrue, it is ridiculous. Firstly, as I've explained already in another video, when the government spends, it creates new money.
I am not bothering to find that other video. I'm just going to quickly put up the bathtub. Well, it's a sink, but whatever. So this is the whole idea of MMT, and this is what Richard Murphy is effectively saying. You turn on the tap, or the faucet if you're an American, and this is apparently, according to MMT, is where pretty much all money comes from. It comes from the government making it. How they explain how Bitcoin has any value, I don't know. That's for another video. And the water obviously coming from the tap represents the money, and that is in the sink is what makes up the economy. Obviously the only way to put new money into the economy is by the government printing it. Now that's true in a way that only central banks can create money, but that isn't what creates wealth. And that's why I absolutely hate this diagram, because it seems to make the assumption that all money has the same value all the time, which obviously it doesn't. And then the plug, or for some reason Americans call it sink stopper, I don't know what's wrong with you. This is the tax policy. You obviously lift up the plug more to allow more money to flow out. Apparently this goes back into the government, so that goes back through the tap, so you're going to have dirty water, but anyway, it's a hypothetical. And this is how MMTers obviously think the whole thing runs. And it effectively is turning the whole idea of how government actually works on its head. Because obviously, as it says at the bottom, the drain is taxes, and that's what takes money away and out of the economy. However, that doesn't make any sense either, because the money just goes straight back in thanks to the tap anyway. And the whole idea of this is that if you keep inflation under control and at around 2%, effectively that means you're taxing everyone at 2%, by the way, that's all that really means, then you can keep this whole situation under control, and that is what dictates how much money you can put into the economy. Quite a few people misunderstand this and basically means that the government can never run out of money, but then they always have to asterisk that, saying, oh, but to be fair, you need taxes to keep inflation under control, which basically just means that, yes, with extra steps, taxes are funding government spending, which is what all the Austrian schools say anyway. But because they have this mindset, they think, obviously, oh, just turn the taps on and you'll never get hyperinflation. At this point, I would like to let everyone know that a pound today is worth a 3/4 of that of a pound 4 years ago. Now, that's obviously not quite hyperinflation, but what has happened since COVID 4 years ago is that quantitative easing was put on steroids, which is all this sink is representing, by the way. As you can see here, the highest spike in government borrowing that we had, that added obviously to the national debt, absolutely spiked. GDP per capita absolutely flatlined, and GDP is still basically where it was in 2007. In other words, MMTers are absolutely wrong, and I don't know why they keep on trying to claim that they're right, you just need to do quantitative easing harder. Quantitative easing is just kicking the can down the road and does not at all address the fact that we are a low productivity economy because of, I'm just going to say it, because of people like NIMBYs and the anti-growth coalition, we're literally not allowed to innovate and actually improve productivity in any way. And yes, that includes house building, I'm afraid. Because even then, the houses we are building are complete garbage. Oh, and also I'd like to point out again at this point that immigration has not improved any of this. Everything has stagnated.
Then it has to collect that money back to prevent inflation. And that's what taxation does in the main.
Again, I already explained this with the sink, but how is this not just saying taxes fund government spending with extra steps? If taxes are only there to curb inflation, why not just have less government spending? Oh, because we need to incentivize the economy to make it grow. Yeah, great. We've been doing that since 2008. How many years is that? That's 16 years. You know, we've cracked a few omelettes. Where cracked a few omelettes? We've cracked a few eggs. Where are the omelettes?
It cancels the impact of the new money creation that the government does whenever it spends by literally bringing that money back in by way of taxation.
This is why Hayek was right when he said that we should have competition between currencies. Because having centralized supply on this, effectively it's allowed people to make ridiculous theories like this, put them into practice, and then absolutely do nothing to change the theory when it's clearly not working. This can maybe work and probably does actually work in the US. We can't really do it here because we're not world hegemon and we are not improving productivity like the US is. However, in reality, the whole reason for adding to the money supply, which is effectively just a commodity, it's not this special, unique entity that has magic properties, it is still beholden to basic supply and demand principles. And effectively, what happens if you have the same amount of money supply while productivity and GDP increase is that you get deflation. Now, you don't always want deflation, you want sometimes a deflation to encourage saving to then make big investments. However, you don't want it all the time, and if your productivity constantly increases and you don't put more money into the money supply, then what ends up happening is that you have extended periods of deflation and people don't invest. Now, MMTs go the complete opposite way, and this is why they get central banks to buy bonds and to increase national debt and to have rather large taxes. It's so that they can always be in a state of inflation, and they try and keep it at 2% because no one gets really mad if they lose 2% of their value of money every year, but they're getting pay increases of 10% or 5% or something like that. People can live with that. The problem is with what we've been having in the UK, as I keep saying, is that our productivity hasn't gone up. Wages have completely stagnated. We are seeing massive amounts of inflation. This is why people say we are living in a cost of living crisis. It's because the value of our money keeps going down. We can't afford as much. And this is entirely down to mostly, I shouldn't say entirely, mostly down to the modern monetary theory being put into practice and getting us nowhere. And here is Richard Murphy saying, well, don't worry about all that because we can't tax you anymore, but we do have a national debt to make sure that we can get over that. When classically all the national debt was really there for was to make a war machine when we had 2 world wars and were beating Napoleon at Waterloo. Basically, the only reason Britain ever went into a massive amount of national debt in the past was to become world hegemon and try and keep a foothold on becoming world hegemon by having a massive navy. This was then to protect trade routes so that we could obviously trade internationally via our empire and other empires. Well, Britain was the place where everything was being manufactured, and from there we could improve GDP and therefore reduce national debt burden. But we're not doing that these days because instead of funding a navy, we're funding the NHS and pensions, which are not useful in any way.
But it doesn't always want to cancel all the money it's created. In fact, most of the time it won't, because either there's been inflation, it's modest but nonetheless real, and it therefore needs to leave more money in the economy so that there is more liquidity in that economy to make sure that there is enough money to go around, or it wants to stimulate the economy by literally spending a bit more than it collects by tax.
Again, this is just getting the whole thing backwards. What Richard Murphy is trying to say is that government spending is obviously money created, and then when that money is invested in pension funds or whatever, sometimes they spend more than they have, and therefore they need to borrow some of that money. But he is trying to frame it as, oh, they need to borrow money to keep inflation under control, because obviously you can't borrow money to pay for things. That's not how government works, when actually that's exactly how government works. I'm so fed up of the lie that you cannot compare government spending to a household budget. They effectively are the same thing. Yes, a household cannot create money. What a household can do is create more wealth, though, which is effectively trying to do the same thing. And if it spends beyond its means, then it has to do the same thing as the government, and either bring in more wealth, however it may do that, it either has to cut its spending, which the government does as well, or they have to borrow the money from somewhere. It's exactly the same as the government, and I'm fed up of hearing that they're not the same, or at least very analogous.
But that means there is that extra money in the economy, and ultimately that won't be spent because the first person who gets the money clearly will benefit from it, pay their taxes on it, and then spend it, whether that's on employees, whether that's on expenses for their business, or if it's an individual, on literally keeping their household going. Then the next recipient will receive the money, pay the taxes, and then spend, and so on, until somebody, somewhere down the line, and it doesn't matter how far they are down the line, somebody somewhere will save.
I think Richard Murphy has just explained trickle-down economics. Naturally, as a post-Keynesian and, quite frankly, socialist, he shouldn't be trying to describe trickle-down economics here. And again, trickle-down economics has never actually been a phrase said by Reagan or pretty much any other capitalist. The whole point that capitalists make is that when you make the amount of wealth larger, everyone obviously benefits. Because the people being productive will end up being more productive, allowing them to spend more of their money, and that will circulate more through the economy. Everyone who is being more productive will benefit more. A good way to make people more productive is by cutting taxes to encourage investments, which will help us find the most productive businesses that we have. This is the whole theory of capitalism. Trickle-down economics is simply never stated by any serious capitalist or free marketeer thinker. But as we have just heard, Richard Murphy is more than happy to effectively explain it without using the word trickle down.
Now, what's the role of the national debt? It's actually there to mop up those savings.
It's absolutely crazy to me that MMTers are literally saying to individuals, don't save money, that's bad. Saving money is perfectly reasonable if you, say, want to start a business in the future, or buy a car in the future, or save for retirement. It is obviously useful. But Richard Murphy's saying the quiet part out loud. The whole point of national debt is effectively to keep inflation at 2% or higher, so that effectively the government can take 2% of that savings every year. That's the whole point. That's what inflation is. It's just a tax by another means. And if that's all you're using the national debt for, then it's absolutely pointless having it. We don't need that.
In exactly the same way as tax is necessary to mop up cash in the economy to make sure there isn't too much inflation, we need to have a growing national debt if the government runs a deficit to mop up the excess cash that ultimately is going to be saved as a consequence of that excess spending that the government has chosen to make.
So to put that in more layman's terms, because even I found that confusing, Richard Murphy seems to think that all money comes from government spending, and as it all trickles down or what have you, some people are going to save, and we need a national debt to, as I say, reap the benefit of that saving via borrowing money to stimulate inflation. When the ANCAPs or whatever say taxation is theft, it's quite hard to argue against that when they're saying this quiet part out loud. They are literally trying to reap the benefits of your savings after it's already been taxed to hell and back.
That's why the government has to make available savings facilities to people so that they can return that money to it to effectively balance the equation with regard to the issue of new money.
So, to simplify it, in the same way that MMTers think that tax is simply there to bring spending under control, the national debt is there to bring savings under control. I mean, you have to be allergic to a free market to think any of this is a good idea. As I say, this was all ramped up, from 2008? We have seen basically no benefit from it. How are you still defending it?
So the national debt plays an essential role in managing the money supply, but it does some other things as well. In particular, the national debt is largely made up of government bonds. Now, there's nothing secret about government bonds. They are simply deposit accounts issued by the government for fixed periods of time. So, for 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, 30 years, 70 years even, with a fixed interest rate over that period, and then they are repaid.
I mean, pretty much, but he's missed an important point, which is that the interest repayments are actually paid year on year to whoever holds the bond, and then your original investment money is given back to you after whatever year period it is. Yeah, the whole point is that bonds are effectively an investment to the government. However, the government actually guarantees that you will obviously get all the money back plus the money you're owed. So it's obviously a hell of a lot safer than putting it into the stock market. However, at the same time, you're also not going to be making as much, since bond yields at this point are something like 2%. Historically, they're typically between 5 and 8%, but we need them super low because the government really wants to borrow a load of money. This was also the issue with Liz Truss. The Bank of England ended up quantitative easing on steroids again to stimulate investment into the government and raise bond yields, and obviously that caused borrowing to be... The cost of borrowing more than doubled when Liz Truss came in, so obviously with the mini-budget, oh look, she's cutting taxes, that means we're going to have to borrow more, oh look, the price for borrowing has gone right up, that means she needs to be kicked out. Again, Liz Truss was given a bad hand, she played it badly, but at the same time the Bank of England absolutely were trying to kick her out. I just wanted to touch upon that. Because Richard Murphy is making this sound like free money, and in reality there's no such thing.
Normally by issuing another bond to replace the old one.
As I titled this video, this is just an infinite money glitch. Why not just up the amount of government bonds that are issued? If all we're going to do to pay off previous bonds is just make new bonds anyway, this is just an infinite loop of borrowing, 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 and borrowing. It's like, why do we have it? Oh, to pay for previous borrowing. Okay. This doesn't seem sustainable.
The point about the national debt is that it provides a very safe way of saving for large companies. You and I, if we put our money into a bank account, we get a guarantee from the government that £85,000 that we deposit with any one bank will be guaranteed to be repaid even if that bank fails.
Well, this is why government borrowing had to go up in the first place, because, yeah, a load of banks defaulted, and the government had to bail them out, and this is why basically everyone in the UK actually owns all the banks. Is Richard Murphy trying to say that the banking crisis was good? Was the banking crisis good because it forced national debt up? Is that your theory, Richard Murphy?
But if you're a large company who wants to put £1 billion into a bank, that guarantee isn't worth a lot. 85,000 quid is, well, peanuts compared to the amount they've got on deposit. And we have known since 2008 that banks can now fail, because they did in that year as part of the global financial crisis.
Thanks for the history lesson, but yes, if big companies want to make a guaranteed return on investment, government bonds are a good way to do it. However, as pointed out, you can have more government bonds without increasing the debt to GDP ratio by actually improving GDP. If this money that the government is borrowing is not being used in any way to actually stimulate the economy, what is the point? Literally, what is the point?
So how do money markets work instead? The large companies who want to save buy government bonds from banks, and then they sell them backwards and forwards in what is called a repo market. But the government bonds provide the security for that. Literally, the City of London couldn't operate without government bonds being in existence.
Sure, but this isn't explaining why it's a good thing to have more debt. Which, if Richard Murphy was being honest, this is the issue people have. We have a government debt that is ever rising and is equivalent to times where we were in battles all over the world trying to establish a British Empire. We're not trying to establish a British Empire, we have an economy that is effectively all based on restricting the housing market and putting an NHS tumour on top of it. At least back in the day in the 1700s, we were trying to establish world trade. But today we've already established that, and as I say, all the economy, the public spending is trying to do is keep old people alive for longer and pay them benefits on top of that, while the people that are productive are constantly disincentivised from being more productive. That is obviously the issue here, and the national debt is just showing us that while it's rising, the money isn't being spent properly, invested properly, anything like that. That is the whole issue here, Richard Murphy, but you are completely dishonest and think people saying the national debt is going mental is people saying we shouldn't have one at all. No, there is obviously a point to it. It's just the thing is that, as you can see from this graph, typically the national debt is going down to about 30-40%, something like that, when we have the economy running at peak capacity. That is what I would like to see.
And there's another fundamental reason why we need government bonds. About a quarter of the bonds really in issue in the UK are held by overseas governments or overseas companies who want to hold sterling to facilitate trade.
Yep, that's fine. As I say, there is a point to national debt. I have no doubt about that. But obviously, that ratio of overseas companies and governments holding British gilts should make up about half of all government bonds rather than a quarter. In fact, they should probably make up the majority of government bonds. That's probably the point.
Finally, every single private pension in the UK is ultimately underpinned by the existence of government bonds, which are the only guaranteed income stream which will exist for the remainder of a person's life once they reach retirement age.
Yep, again, absolutely fine. Nobody is saying otherwise. I don't know why Richard Murphy is completely dishonest about the critics of 100% national debt, which is obviously crazy and needs to be brought under control, given that annually something like £83 billion is being spent on the interest of the public debt alone. That's £83 billion that could be spent on the NHS, by the way, just saying.
When our politicians say it's got to be repaid, they're talking nonsense.
I mean, I'm not sure which MPs have said it needs to be repaid, because I am actually on Richard's side of it here. It's not necessarily that it needs to be repaid, it's more that GDP needs to grow to a point where the national debt is brought down to, as I say, 30-40%. That seems to be the Goldilocks area. But as I say, I guess it's easier just to take the silly things that some MPs have said, saying we need to repay the whole thing, rather than address the main and correct point being made, which is that debt to GDP ratio being 100% is unsustainable, and it's only going up, and that's bad.
So I just wish they'd stop talking that nonsense and talk about the reality that we need a national debt, and thank God we've got one.
Anyway, this is then a video Richard Murphy put out 4 days later.
We don't have a national debt in the UK.
Oh, that's really interesting. Look, I have changed my perspective on things in the past. I don't think I've ever changed my perspective on something in 4 days. And if I have done, there is no way that I would start a video like this and not at all address the fact that my last video was saying that we need the thing that I'm now saying we don't have. Again, just to lay it on thick, point of his first video, we need a national debt. Start of this video, we don't have a national debt. Why is he not panicking?
We do have national savings, but we don't have a national debt.
Oh, is this just reframing national debt into national savings? Because if that's the case, then this is the worst clickbait I've ever seen.
Why do I say we haven't got a national debt? Well, the simple fact is that the national debt has two sides to it.
Yeah, he's trying to reframe the national debt so that it doesn't seem as scary to people. Oh, we have 100%... He must have got quite a reaction to his first video, to people saying, no one's saying we don't need a national debt, you idiot. And now he's trying to say, actually, the more national debt we have, the better. You know, were things better during World War I and II, Richard? Is that the point?
One side is that the government owes somebody money, and therefore we say they're in debt. And the other side is that somebody has an asset. This is true of all financial transactions in the world. Every transaction has two sides to it.
Yeah, sure, that's true. And as you said before, and I'm sure you're going to go into, yes, those savings are guaranteed by the government. The problem is what then happens if we default on the debt? What is happening to all those socialist countries in the world like Venezuela and, well, not anymore, but obviously recently Argentina, when they started seeing hyperinflation and started seeing that their economy simply couldn't be run anymore. Well, they were in dire straits, and then you get someone like Malayan who basically comes along and says, look, obviously this needs to be run a bit more like a household, so a flower to these absolutely ridiculous governmental departments. I'm firing the guy that didn't stop my pay rise, and I'm going to encourage business and growth absolutely everywhere in the economy. It's going to be great. And I can't tell you how much I'm praying that that becomes the most successful country in South America. However, Richard Murphy obviously doesn't want any of that and just says, just keep the national debt going up, because don't you understand, that means that people are saving. Despite the fact, as he said before, a quarter of it isn't actually people saving, it's other governments and big companies buying the bonds, and it's mainly big companies buying government bonds anyway.
In the case of our so-called national debt...
Yeah, this entire video is just clickbait and reframing. It's pretty bad.
Undoubtedly, the government has a credit, which is said to be a debt, but somebody else has a debit, and that is an asset.
Oh my god, this is the exact same type of thinking that got us into the banking crisis of 2008. Man, don't you understand? Yeah, all these banks are going into massive debt that they defaulted on, but don't you understand? This means that more people can afford mortgages. Yeah, and as pointed out, what happens when that all defaults? Like, the government can just print more money. Yeah, how did that go, as I say, for all these socialist countries? The Treaty of Versailles, the German government had a massive national debt, but don't you understand? That was massive savings for someone else. They were in debit.
Now, that asset is private wealth, because quite literally, what the national debt represents is money that people have chosen to deposit with the government for safekeeping.
Again, I've got to get this graph back up. Are you telling me, right, that at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, when it was 260% debt to GDP ratio, that somehow we had private wealth that was 250% of British GDP? Are you insane, sir?
That's something which is identical to what happens with a bank. People can choose to save their money in a bank, and when they do, nobody goes around and says, oh, the bank's in trouble, it's in debt, it's got to repay everybody who put money into it, and therefore if it doesn't, it will all go bust.
What the hell are you talking about? 4 days ago you talked about the 2008 financial crisis. On screen now, I have clips of hundreds of people waiting outside branches of Northern Rock, which, if you haven't heard of it before, it was one of the fallen banks during the 2008 financial crisis, where exactly what you said no one ever says, people were literally saying they were taking their money out because they were worried that the bank would run out of money. Like, this is exactly what happened, and you referenced this in your last video. What the hell is wrong with you?
No, they don't. They actually want to encourage people to put money in the bank, because the more money the bank has, the better it looks to be, the stronger it is, the more likely it is it can pay off its creditors. Everyone feels as though they would like to be in the biggest bank because that is the safest bank.
You referenced the 2008 financial crash before, yes. People, and as you referenced last time as well, yes, obviously there is a point to a national debt. There is a point to banks. There is a point to borrowing money. When we are clearly borrowing beyond our means, though, that is the issue. For God's sake, if you could just print infinite money, why don't they just do that? Oh, because inflation will hit. Also, hyperinflation does exist then. This man is a moron.
Well, why don't we use that logic when we look at the government? The government is already the ultimate safe place to put your money because they make the money and therefore can always repay you without fail, whatever happens, because they can always make some more.
Then why even allow private banks to exist if you can just have a safe place to put your money? Why ever put your money into a bank when you can just put it in government gilts? Is it because it's slightly higher risk but a bigger payoff? Even then, that's not true. That's why everyone's putting their money into ISAs if they know anything about making money from savings.
But more than that, the government is simply providing you with a safe place to put your money when it creates the national debt, as it is called. It offers you a savings facility, and we know that's true because it's called National Savings and Investments, or NS&I.
Richard Murphy is absolutely the type of person to say that the Nazis weren't socialists just because they were called socialists. But anyway, yes, debt from government is saving for someone else. Like, I am fine with that. This is obviously just turned into a clickbait title, but the juxtaposition was still amazing.
Which includes things like premium bonds. They're part of the national debt, by the way. So if you own any, or if you know somebody who owns any, they've got part of the national debt. They don't think that there's any crisis being created by that.
No, I think they do when they keep seeing that taxes are being raised to, help pay it off. When they get premium bonds, by the way, when they get them and they get them paid off, yeah, part of the £83 billion a year that's only rising at the moment, by the way, is the money they're getting, but guess what? It just gets taken away anyway via taxation. There's a whole incestuous relationship here, and the fact that you can't make these links is actually quite embarrassing. Effectively, all this money does is help pay for the civil service. Great. I'd rather just lose the national debt entirely.
They actually think they've got something which is valuable. They have. They really do have, because the government will pay it back to them if they want to be repaid, because it's a savings account.
I wonder what Richard Murphy would say if absolutely everyone went to the NSNI and demanded to take out all their money. What happened to Northern Rock?
But they also offer things like straightforward savings and deposit accounts. I've actually got some savings with NSNI. Seemed like a good deal at the time.
Seemed like a good deal at the time. Why doesn't it seem like a good deal anymore? I hope you expand on that.
What about the rest of the so-called national debt? Most of it is called government bonds.
Oh no, guess we're moving on to government bonds. I imagine he's just going to go over the same thing as the last video. If so, I'm just going to skip to an interesting part.
If you save your money in a bond with a high street bank, only you can get the money back. If you save your money in a bond that the government issues, you can sell the bond to somebody else. That's literally the only difference between what the high street bank offers you and what the government offers you.
Again, why ever invest in a high street bank then? He's making it out like there's absolutely no advantage to going to a high street bank. Why not just put all your money into the NSNI, since you can just sell those accounts to someone else? Because not only are you guaranteed money from the government, apparently you can just sell your bond at any time to someone else as well. Why ever put money in a bank if the money's not going to go up? I mean, obviously I put my money into an ISA, but why do that if it's apparently not guaranteed investment and payoff, despite the fact that, as he said in the last video, the first 85,000 are guaranteed anyway? This is such a dishonest framing of the whole issue. It's gone from the national debt is good actually to, oh, it actually needs to be as high as possible so that there's more private wealth being shared around. Again, 250 debt to GDP ratio back in the Napoleonic War era. Apparently we had private wealth equal to 250% of GDP. It's just nonsense.
So if we've got piles of money being saved with the government, do we have a government with a debt crisis when none of those people want to be repaid? They're all very happy to hold their money there and they don't want it back.
Yeah, but you've got to reframe the question there, don't you? Look at all these people getting complete positives out of the national debt. I'm going to ignore the negative of higher taxes and higher inflation to actually pay them back. If you ask these people, would they rather have lower taxes and no government bonds, or the highest taxes possible with the highest government bonds, I think they'd go for option one. Again, this reframing of the whole issue is just so dishonest. It's just funny. Again, this man came quite close to being quite a big influence over the UK's economic policy. Like, thank God he didn't, because he'd be putting the national debt through the goddamn roof to pay for council houses and trains.
No, of course we haven't got a debt crisis. And nor should we be obsessing about how we have to repay it, because it's a burden on our grandchildren. The truth is, the lucky grandchildren will inherit part of the national debt because it's part of their parents or grandparents or whoever else's estate left to them in their wills.
Goodness me, what about the unlucky grandchildren? Yeah, great. This is great for those people that paid into government bonds for 150 years and whatever, and passing that down to their kids. Right, yeah, that's great for them. But we're in an incentive structure where people are not incentivized to save. This is why everyone invests and puts them into ISAs. Like, that's not necessarily saving, that's investing, and it comes with risk. These investment portfolios put money constantly into companies that keep failing. They're going to end up losing money. Like, yeah, there's risk there. Again, why ever do that if it's just perfectly safe to put it in the national debt? Why not put the national debt into infinity and beyond and give everyone free money since it's so good and it's just a savings account? You know, oh, just put the money into the government bonds. As it keeps going up, we can keep paying you back more. It'll be great. Absolutely crazy. Everyone paying to the government debt, you can just pass it on to your kids. Okay. They have to keep printing money for that, sure. They have to keep taxing you so that we can pay it back, sure. Doesn't really matter, though. It's a savings account. It's great. Absolutely insane person.
So the truth is that we don't have a national debt, we just have a national savings bank.
He mentioned the goddamn banking crisis last video. How is he this stupid?
And just as banks have creditors on their balance sheets for the sums that they owe back to the people who saved with them, so does the government. But it doesn't mean it's in debt as such. It just means it's operating a banking facility. And that's what, in this case, the credit on its balance sheet means.
Trying to say that the national debt is just like a bank when our last financial crisis before COVID was a banking crisis doesn't exactly inspire hope into me. I'm not going to lie.
There is no possible debt crisis in the UK created by people wanting to save with the government. Let's stop talking about the national debt as if it's a burden, and let's start looking at it as if it's a national asset, because that's exactly what it is.
Yes, it's a national asset for people who own bonds, which, as you say, is either other countries, overshore companies, or large companies. They hold up the majority, and then obviously there are private individuals who do it as well, sure. Guess who has to pay the interest on them? Because it's not the government making the country more productive, it's my tax money, for God's sake. Sure, I can put money into some government bonds and make money off that. There is no way it is going to make up for the money that I'm spending on tax, though, is it? £83 billion a year as of 2022 to 2023. That is 2/3 of the amount we spend on the NHS per year. No, sorry, that's not even true. That's what Corbyn thought it was back in 2015. It's about half of what we spend on the NHS. We could literally improve the NHS's budget, not that I'm advocating this, by 50% by keeping the national debt under control. But no, let's just keep spending that 80-odd billion on the national debt interest alone, for God's sake. Absolutely insane person to think that you can just have an infinite growth here with the national debt and expect to not run into any crises. If you can't run into a crisis via the national debt, why is it every time that Britain improved its economy, the national debt went down in ratio to the GDP? Obviously keeping it between 30% and 40% is the ideal. Can we please go back to that? You can keep the national debt level to where it is in terms of pure gross spending on it. Just improve GDP. I would be happy with that. And no, immigration is not doing that. Right, anyway, I've made it through Richard Murphy's completely moronic takes there. I hope you enjoyed the video, because that's all I am going through today. In terms of shilling, do become a channel member if you so wish. The other side of the hill is on tonight. It's the classic newscast one, so please come along and join that. There will be no regional variation tomorrow. However, I should be on Publish and Be Damned, where we are reading Enoch Powell's Wrestling with the Angel, where he talks about his takes on Christianity and the Bible. That will be on the Wellington Project's channel too this Friday, so catch me there. Laughing at the Guardian returns next week, because I got a busy weekend. Right, as I say, that's everything I had for you today, so once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.